It's the summer of 1991 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The city buzzes with life beer flowing from the famous breweries, the crack of baseball bats at County Stadium, and the steady rhythm of blue-collar workers heading home after long shifts in the factories that built America's heartland. But behind one apartment door on North 25th Street, in a building that looked just like any other, an unimaginable horror waited to be discovered, a secret so dark, so twisted, that it would shake the very foundations of what we thought we knew about human nature. This is the story of Jeffrey Dahmer, the Milwaukee Cannibal, a man who walked among us, who looked so ordinary that he could have been your neighbor, your co-worker, someone you passed on the street without a second glance. But beneath that unremarkable exterior lurked a darkness that would eventually claim 17 innocent lives. Before the mugshot that would become infamous around the world. Before the trial that would captivate and horrify millions. Before the name Jeffrey Dahmer became synonymous with evil itself, there was just a boy who seemed, to most who knew him, just like any other. But as we'll discover, the signs were there from the very beginning. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to what appeared to be a typical American family. His father, Lionel Dahmer, was an analytical chemist, a man of science, who worked with formulas and equations, believing in logic and reason. His mother, Joyce, was a former telephone operator who struggled with her mental health, experiencing bouts of depression and anxiety that would plague their household throughout Jeffrey's formative years. The Dahmers lived in a modest home in a quiet neighborhood where children rode bicycles down tree-lined streets and mothers hung laundry on backyard clotheslines. It was the picture of American suburban life. But inside their home, tensions simmered beneath the surface. From an early age, Jeffrey showed signs that something wasn't quite right. While other children played with toys and friends, Jeffrey was drawn to something far more disturbing. He was fascinated with dead animals, not in the way a curious child might be, but with an intensity that unsettled those around him. He would collect roadkill from the streets around his neighborhood, carrying the decaying carcasses home like trophies. Behind his family's home, in a small shed that his father had built, Jeffrey would spend hours dissecting these animals with surgical precision. He studied their anatomy, their bone structure, the way their organs fit together like pieces of a macabre puzzle. To most adults who witnessed this behavior, it seemed like morbid curiosity, perhaps, the sign of a future veterinarian or doctor. His father, being a man of science, even encouraged what he saw as Jeffrey's interest in biology. But for Jeffrey, it felt natural. It felt right. It filled a void inside him that nothing else could touch. His father taught him about chemicals, how formaldehyde could preserve tissue, how bleaching agents could strip flesh from bone. Lionel thought he was nurturing his son's scientific mind. He had no idea he was providing the tools for something far more sinister. By the time Jeffrey reached Revere High School in nearby Bath Township, Ohio, where the family had moved, he had become a ghost among his peers. While other teenagers formed cliques, went on dates, and planned for their futures, Jeffrey existed in a world entirely his own. He was quiet, almost invisible. Teachers described him as polite but distant. Classmates barely remembered he was there. He moved through the hallways like a shadow, detached from the vibrant social life that pulsed around him. When he did interact with others, it was often through bizarre pranks and attention-seeking behavior that made him seem more like a class clown than a potential killer. But there was one thing that Jeffrey had discovered could quiet the dark thoughts that consumed his mind. Alcohol. He began drinking heavily during his sophomore year, often showing up to class intoxicated with a bottle hidden in his locker or car. The alcohol numbed the growing fantasies that plagued his thoughts, fantasies of control, of possession, of death. Remarkably, no one stopped him. Teachers noticed, but looked the other way. His parents were dealing with their own marital problems and seemed oblivious to their son's growing addiction. Jeffrey was drowning in plain sight, and nobody threw him a lifeline. As his senior year drew to a close in 1978, Jeffrey managed to graduate despite his alcohol abuse and increasingly erratic behavior. But while his classmates celebrated and made plans for college or careers, Jeffrey was planning something else entirely. The fantasies that had sustained him through his lonely teenage years were about to become reality. His parents' marriage finally collapsed that summer. His mother took his younger brother and left for Wisconsin, while his father moved out temporarily. For the first time in his life, Jeffrey Dahmer was completely alone in the family home. And in that isolation, with no one to watch him, no one to stop him, the monster that had been growing inside him was finally free to emerge. It was June 18, 1978. A warm summer day in Ohio when the world changed forever, though no one knew it at the time. Stephen Mark Hicks was 18 years old, the same age as Jeffrey. He was a free spirit with shoulder-length brown hair and dreams of seeing his favorite band in concert. He stood on the side of the road with his thumb extended, trusting in the kindness of strangers, a trust that would cost him his life. Jeffrey was driving aimlessly that day, as he often did when the loneliness became unbearable. When he saw Stephen on the roadside, something clicked inside his mind. Here was an opportunity. Here was someone who wouldn't be missed immediately. Someone who had willingly isolated himself from help. Jeffrey pulled over and offered Stephen a ride. Stephen gratefully accepted, climbing into the passenger seat with the innocent trust of youth. Jeffrey was charming. Engaging, nothing about him suggested danger. He offered Stephen not just a ride, but an invitation to his house for a few beers and some music before continuing to the concert. Stephen agreed. They drove to Jeffrey's empty house, where they sat in the living room, drinking beer and listening to music. For a few hours, Jeffrey almost felt normal, like he had a friend, like he was part of the world instead of just observing it from the outside. Stephen talked about his life, his dreams, his plans for the future. But when Stephen announced it was time to leave, when he stood up and headed toward the door, something snapped inside Jeffrey's mind. The fantasy of control, of possession, of never being alone again, it all came rushing to the surface. He couldn't let Stephen leave. He wouldn't let him leave. What happened next would be burned into Jeffrey's memory forever. In a moment of panic and rage, he grabbed a 10-pound dumbbell from his father's exercise equipment. Stephen never saw it coming. The first blow sent him crashing to the floor, but Jeffrey didn't stop there. He continued striking until Stephen's body went still. In the silence that followed, Jeffrey stared at what he had done. Stephen Hicks, a young man with hopes and dreams and people who loved him, was dead. And Jeffrey felt something he had never experienced before. Not remorse, not horror, but a dark satisfaction. The fantasy had become reality, and it felt even better than he had imagined. What came next revealed the true depth of Jeffrey's depravity. Using skills he had learned, dissecting animals and knowledge his father had shared about anatomy, Jeffrey dismembered Stephen's body in the basement. He was methodical, almost clinical, in his approach. When he was finished, he placed the remains in garbage bags and buried them in the woods behind his house. Then, as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just committed one of the most heinous crimes imaginable, Jeffrey Dahmer enlisted in the United States Army. He packed his bags, left the house where Stephen Hicks had died, and began a new chapter of his life, carrying his terrible secret with him. In January 1979, Jeffrey Dahmer found himself stationed in Baumholder, West Germany, serving as a combat medic with the 2nd Battalion, 68th Armored Regiment. For many young men, military service provides structure, purpose, and camaraderie. For Jeffrey, it was simply another place to hide. His fellow soldiers described him as quiet and competent. He performed his duties adequately, showing no signs of the monster that lurked beneath his composed exterior. During the day, he tended to wounded soldiers and maintained medical supplies. But at night, alone in his barracks, the memories of Stephen Hicks haunted him not with guilt, but with a twisted longing to experience that feeling of power and control again. The alcohol that had been his crutch in high school became his constant companion in Germany. He drank heavily and frequently, often alone, using the numbing effects of alcohol to quiet the dark fantasies that grew stronger with each passing day. His drinking became so problematic that it affected his performance and relationships with other soldiers. Military records show multiple incidents of alcohol-related problems during his service. He was disciplined several times for drunkenness and disorderly conduct. His commanding officers noted his increasing isolation and erratic behavior, but, in the military culture of the late 1970s, heavy drinking was often overlooked or even encouraged. By 1981, Jeffrey's alcohol abuse had become so severe that the army had no choice but to discharge him. On March 24, 1981, he was released from service 2 years early due to his drinking problem. He returned to the United States, a different man than the one who had left. His fantasies had grown darker, more detailed, more urgent during his time away. Initially, Jeffrey drifted to Florida, where he lived briefly with his grandmother, but the warm climate and relaxed atmosphere did nothing to calm the storm raging inside his mind. He couldn't hold down a job, couldn't maintain relationships, couldn't find any sense of purpose or belonging in the normal world. Eventually, he returned to Ohio to live with his father and stepmother. For the next several years, he existed in a kind of limbo, occasional jobs, drinking constantly, and struggling with the growing compulsion to kill again. His family knew something was wrong, but had no idea of the true nature of his problems. For nearly a decade after Stephen Hicks's murder, Jeffrey managed to suppress his homicidal urges. There were close-calls moments when he came dangerously close to acting on his fantasies, but perhaps it was fear of being caught, or perhaps some small part of his humanity was still fighting against the darkness. But in 1987, that tenuous control finally snapped. Jeffrey moved to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, the city of his birth, the place where his story had begun. And in Milwaukee, surrounded by the anonymity of urban life, Jeffrey Dahmer's true reign of terror would finally begin. The nearly decade-long silence was about to end in the most horrific way imaginable. In May 1990, Jeffrey Dahmer moved into apartment 213 at the Oxford Apartments, located at 924 North 25th Street in Milwaukee. The building was typical of low-income housing in the area-tired brick facade. Narrow hallways that smelled of cooking and cleaning chemicals, thin walls that barely contained the sounds of daily life. His one-bedroom apartment was sparsely furnished but meticulously clean. To visitors, it appeared normal, a single man's modest living space with a sofa, television, and small dining table. But hidden beneath this veneer of normalcy was a carefully constructed killing ground, would claim the lives of multiple victims. Jeffrey had perfected his hunting method through years of careful observation and practice. He frequented gay bars in Milwaukee's downtown area, bus stops where vulnerable young men waited for transportation, and shopping malls where he could blend into the crowd while stalking potential victims. His approach was always the same: friendly, non-threatening, almost charming. He would strike up conversations with young men, often minorities, who were marginalized by society and less likely to be immediately missed. He offered them money for nude photographs, drinks at his apartment, or simply a place to stay for the night. Once he had lured them to his apartment, Jeffrey would offer his victims alcohol laced with sleeping pills or other sedatives. He was patient, engaging them in conversation, making them feel comfortable and safe. Many of his victims spent their final hours believing they had found a friend, someone who understood them. As the drugs took effect and his victims lost consciousness, Jeffrey's mask of normalcy would slip away completely. What happened next in the confines of apartment 213 defied human comprehension. He would strangle his victims, then engage in acts of necrophilia and dismemberment that revealed the true depths of his depravity. Jeffrey documented his crimes with Polaroid photographs, creating a grotesque gallery that he would later use to relive his experiences. These images, discovered by police, would become some of the most disturbing evidence ever presented in a criminal case. But Jeffrey's crimes went beyond murder. He kept parts of his victims' bodies as trophy skulls in his closet, hearts and other organs in his refrigerator and freezer, torsos dissolved in acid-filled barrels. His apartment became a macabre museum of death, each preserved piece representing a life cut short by his insatiable need for control and possession. The residents of the Oxford apartments began to notice disturbing signs. Strange smells emanated from apartment 213, the sweet, sickening odor of decomposition mixed with industrial chemicals. They heard the sound of power saws and drills at odd hours of the night, followed by periods of absolute silence. Complaints were filed with the building management. Neighbors knocked on Jeffrey's door to confront him about the smells and sounds. When questioned, Jeffrey always had an explanation. He was cleaning fish, conducting amateur taxidermy, or working on hobby projects. His calm, reasonable demeanor convinced most people to accept his explanations and leave him alone. There were several near misses where Jeffrey's crimes might have been discovered earlier. Police were called to the building for noise complaints and disturbances, but Jeffrey's ability to present a normal facade allowed him to avoid detection. Each missed opportunity represented another chance to save lives, another failure of the system to protect the vulnerable. Between 1987 and 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer murdered at least 17 young men in his apartment. Each victim had a name, a life, dreams, and aspirations that were brutally cut short. Stephen Twomey, James Dockstater, Richard Garreau, Anthony Sears, Raymond Smith, Edward Smith, Ernest Miller, David Thomas, Curtis Straughter, Errol Lindsay, Anthony Hughes, Konarak, Sinta Somphone, Matt Turner, Jeremiah Weinberger, Oliver Lacey, and Joseph Breithoff. Their names deserve to be remembered, their lives honored. The killing spree that had begun with Stephen Hicks in 1978 had evolved into something far more systematic and depraved. But Jeffrey's carefully constructed world of death and horror was about to come crashing down in the most dramatic way possible. The night of July 22, 1991, was swelteringly hot in Milwaukee, the kind of oppressive summer heat that made the city feel like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the tension. That something would turn out to be the end of Jeffrey Dahmer's killing spree. Earlier that evening, Jeffrey had encountered 14-year-old Konarak Synthesomphone near the Grand Avenue Mall. Small for his age, and vulnerable, exactly the type of victim Jeffrey preferred. Using his practiced approach, Jeffrey convinced the boy to come to his apartment for photographs in exchange for money. Following his established pattern, Jeffrey drugged Konarak with sleeping pills mixed into an alcoholic drink, but this time, something went wrong. Instead of remaining unconscious, Konarak managed to escape from the apartment while Jeffrey was out purchasing beer. Naked, confused, and speaking limited English, the boy stumbled onto the street seeking help. Two African-American women, Nicole Childress and Sandra Smith, found Konarak and immediately called 911. They could see that something terrible had happened to the boy. He was bleeding, disoriented, and clearly in distress. When police arrived, the women tried to explain that the boy needed medical attention and protection. But Jeffrey had followed Konarak onto the street, and his ability to present a calm, rational facade proved tragically effective once again. He convinced the responding officers that Konarak was his adult boyfriend, who had simply had too much to drink. Despite the protests of the women who had found the boy, police returned Konarak to Jeffrey's apartment. What the officers didn't know was that they had just delivered a child back to his killer. Within hours of being returned to apartment 213, Konarak's synthesome phone was dead. If the police had been more thorough, if they had listened to the concerned women, if they had noticed the smell of death that permeated Jeffrey's apartment, 17 lives might have been saved. 2 months later, on the night of July 22nd, Jeffrey encountered Tracy Edwards, a 32-year-old man from Mississippi who was visiting Milwaukee. Using his usual methods, Jeffrey lured Tracy to his apartment with promises of money and drinks. But Tracy Edwards would prove to be different from Jeffrey's previous victims. Inside the apartment, Jeffrey attempted to handcuff Tracy, managing to secure one cuff to his wrist, before Tracy realized the danger he was in. As Jeffrey tried to complete the restraints, Tracy fought back with a desperation born of the absolute certainty that he was fighting for his life. In the struggle that followed, Tracy managed to punch Jeffrey in the face and break free from his grasp. With one handcuff still dangling from his wrist, he ran for the apartment door while Jeffrey pursued him. Tracy later described seeing photographs of dismembered bodies scattered around the apartment and smelling an odor unlike anything he had ever experienced. Tracy burst out of the Oxford apartments and onto North 25th Street, frantically flagging down the first police car he saw. Officers Robert Roth and Rolf Mueller found Tracy Edwards in a state of extreme distress, with handcuffs on his wrist, and a story that seemed almost too incredible to believe. But when the officers accompanied Tracy back to apartment 213 to investigate his claims, they found Jeffrey Dahmer appearing calm and cooperative. He invited them inside, seemingly unconcerned about what they might discover. That confidence would prove to be his final, fatal mistake. Officer Mueller moved toward the kitchen to look around, and when he opened the refrigerator door, he discovered what would haunt him for the rest of his life. Inside, wrapped in plastic, was a human head. The discovery sent shockwaves through both officers, who immediately called for backup and placed Jeffrey under arrest. What followed was one of the most horrific crime scene investigations in American history. As more officers arrived and began searching the apartment, they uncovered evidence of unimaginable depravity. Photographs of corpses in various stages of dismemberment, severed heads in the refrigerator and freezer, skulls painted and preserved as trophies, a kettle containing decomposed hands and male genitalia, and a 57-gallon drum filled with acid and human remains. The Milwaukee Cannibal had finally been caught. In the days following his arrest, Jeffrey Dahmer made a decision that shocked investigators and legal experts alike. Rather than deny his crimes or claim innocence, he began confessing to murders dating back to 1978. His confessions were detailed, methodical, and delivered with an eerie calm that unsettled everyone who heard them. The trial of Jeffrey Dahmer began on January 30, 1992, and immediately became a media sensation. The Milwaukee County Courthouse was surrounded by news vans and reporters from around the world. Inside, the courtroom was packed with journalists, legal observers, families of victims, and curious members of the public who had somehow managed to secure seats to witness what many were calling the trial of the century. Jeffrey sat at the defendant's table wearing an orange jail jumpsuit. His demeanor calm and detached throughout the proceedings. He showed little emotion as prosecutors detailed his crimes in graphic detail, as if they were discussing someone else's life rather than his own actions. His lack of remorse or emotional response only added to the horror of what he had done. Jeffrey's defense team, led by attorney Gerald Boyle, faced an impossible task. With their client having confessed to the murders and overwhelming physical evidence against him, they couldn't argue innocence. Instead, they entered a plea of guilty but mentally ill, arguing that Jeffrey's actions were the result of severe mental illness rather than calculated evil. The prosecution, led by District Attorney E. Michael McCann, methodically presented evidence that painted Jeffrey as a calculating killer who knew exactly what he was doing. They argued that his ability to plan his crimes, cover up evidence, and present a normal facade to neighbors and police proved that he was legally sane and fully responsible for his actions. Perhaps the most powerful moments of the trial came when family members of Jeffrey's victims were allowed to address the court. One by one, they stood and spoke about their loved ones, not as statistics or case numbers, but as human beings who had been beloved sons, brothers, and friends. Their words brought humanity to what had become an almost incomprehensible case. After weeks of testimony that included some of the most disturbing evidence ever presented in an American courtroom, the jury began their deliberations. The question they faced was not whether Jeffrey Dahmer had committed these crimes. He had confessed, and the evidence was overwhelming, but whether he was legally insane at the time he committed them. On February 15, 1992, after less than 5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. They found Jeffrey Dahmer guilty but sane on all counts. The decision meant that Jeffrey would face the maximum penalty under Wisconsin law, which, at the time, did not include the death penalty. Judge Lawrence Graham sentenced Jeffrey Dahmer to 15 consecutive life terms in prison, a total of 957 years behind bars, with no possibility of parole. As the sentence was read, Jeffrey showed no emotion, accepting his fate with the same detached calm he had displayed throughout the trial. The legal proceedings were over. But, for the families of the victims and the city of Milwaukee, the healing process was just beginning. Jeffrey Dahmer was initially sent to the Columbia Correctional Institution in Port, Wisconsin, where he was placed in solitary confinement for his own protection. Prison officials knew that his crimes made him a target for other inmates, many of whom viewed child killers and serial killers as the lowest form of criminal. In the isolation of his cell, Jeffrey claimed to have found religion. He spent hours reading the Bible and religious literature, and he was baptized by a local minister in May 1994. He gave several interviews to journalists and claiming that he had come to understand the magnitude of his crimes and felt genuine remorse for his actions. In these interviews, Jeffrey appeared thoughtful and articulate, discussing his crimes with clinical detachment. He claimed that his actions were driven by a need for companionship and control that he couldn't satisfy through normal relationships. Some who interviewed him believed his expressions of remorse were genuine, while others saw them as another manifestation of his manipulative nature. Jeffrey received thousands of letters from people around the world, some from those fascinated by his crimes, others from individuals who claimed to understand or even sympathize with him. He answered some of these letters, maintaining correspondence with a small group of people who seemed drawn to his notoriety. Despite being in protective custody, Jeffrey's presence in the prison created tension among the general population. Many inmates, particularly those who had children of their own, expressed outrage at his crimes. Death threats were common, and prison officials had to remain constantly vigilant to prevent violence against him. In November 1994, Jeffrey was moved to general population and assigned to a work detail cleaning the prison gymnasium. This decision would prove to be fatal. Prison officials believed that enough time had passed for tensions to cool, but they had underestimated the depth of hatred that Jeffrey's crimes had generated among his fellow inmates. Among the inmates working the same detail was Christopher, a 25-year-old man serving a life sentence for murder. Scarver was known to be mentally unstable, and had a particular hatred for Jeffrey Dahmer and another inmate, Jesse Anderson, who had been convicted of killing his wife and blaming the crime on African-American attackers. On the morning of November 28, 1994, Jeffrey and Anderson were left alone in the prison gymnasium for approximately 20 minutes, while their guard attended to other duties. What happened next would end Jeffrey Dahmer's life and close one of the most disturbing chapters in American criminal history. When guards returned, they found Jeffrey and Anderson severely beaten. Jeffrey had suffered massive head trauma from attacks with a metal bar that Scarver had removed from exercise equipment. He was rushed to a nearby hospital, but was pronounced dead less than an hour later. Jesse Anderson died 2 days later from his injuries. Christopher Scarver later claimed that God had told him to kill Jeffrey Dahmer, and that he had been disgusted by Jeffrey's habit of fashioning fake body parts from food and leaving them around the prison to disturb other inmates. And just like that, Jeffrey Dahmer was dead. No final trial, no last words of remorse or defiance, no legacy worth preserving or remembering. But while his story ended in a prison gymnasium in Wisconsin, the scars he left behind would last forever. 17 young men had lost their lives to satisfy one man's twisted fantasies: Stephen Hicks, Stephen Twomey, James Dockstater, Richard Guerrero, Anthony Sears, Raymond Smith, Edward Smith, Ernest Miller, David Thomas, Curtis Strotter, Errol Lindsay, Anthony Hughes, Conorak, Cinta Somphorn, Matt Turner, Jeremiah Weinberger, Oliver Lacey, and Joseph Brick. Each name represents not just a victim, but a family destroyed, dreams unfulfilled, and a future stolen. The city of Milwaukee struggled to heal from the trauma of learning that such evil had existed in their midst. The Oxford apartments were eventually demolished, but the psychological scars remained. The case led to changes in police procedures, particularly regarding how officers respond to calls involving vulnerable individuals. Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes have been the subject of countless books, documentaries, and films, but in consuming this content, we must remember that behind the sensational headlines and Hollywood dramatizations were real people whose lives were cut short by unimaginable brutality. The name Jeffrey Dahmer has become synonymous with evil itself, a reminder that monsters can hide behind the most ordinary faces, that evil can exist in the most unexpected places. He was the man who hid hell behind an apartment door, and his legacy serves as a dark warning about the depths of human depravity. The Milwaukee Cannibal is gone, but he will never be forgotten, not because his story deserves to be remembered, but because the lives he took deserve to be honored, and because we must never forget the importance of protecting the vulnerable among us. Rest in peace to the 17 souls whose lives were stolen. May their memories be a blessing, and may we never forget their names.